for your encouragement and for all your support. I also take this time to thank the Cathedral for permitting our members of our fellowship to be associated with this Cathedral for the entire academic year, to learn from the church and also to serve the church. Some of the students of the Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary will be regularly visiting your church and minister to you. And I also bring greetings from the family of the Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary, and we wish and pray that God will continue to be with you in the days to come. A parachutist was flying on the sky, and suddenly he was blown off. He fell down and he was caught on a tree, and he was shouting for help. And to his surprise, he found a gentleman passed by. He shouted from there, "Sir, could you please help me?" Then the gentleman was looking around and said, "Sure, I am ready to help you." The parachutist asked him, "Could you please tell me, where am I?" And then the gentleman was looking around and found the person hanging upside down and said, "Sir, yes, I found you. You are hanging on a tree upside down." Then the parachutist was saying, "Yes, you are right." And he continued saying that, "Sir, you must be a theologian. You must be definitely a theologian." The gentleman was surprised to hear that, "Yes, I am a theologian. How do you know that I am a theologian?" And he said, the parachutist said, "Yes, sir, it was very simple. What you said was absolutely true, but useless. What you said was absolutely true, but useless." Theological education for the people of God, making them to live faithfully, to make them theologically, to live theologically. Theology is not primarily a way of thinking, but a way of living. Theology has nothing to do with life. Many people say that. Theology is learning something in abstract terms. Many people still believe that theology is learning something in abstract terms. No. Theology has to do with everyday life. And the question is, what has theology to do with the life of the people? Theology is a science of living. The topic given for our reflection this morning is theological education, making of the faithful. Making the faithful. And you may be wondering why such a topic was given for reflection for the congregation, for the laity, the people of God. And such topics should be preached in the theological seminaries. The importance of theological education. Why to the people of God in the church on Sunday morning? Often we think that theological education is meant for the theological teachers or the theological community or the people who are chosen for a special purpose to serve in the church. Remember, the objective of theological education is not to produce pujaris to work in the church. The objective of theological education is not to produce pundits to serve in the theological institutions. Theological education for the people of God. Theological education for the people of God, making them to live theologically. Living theologically. Perhaps this is the purpose of giving this topic for our reflection this morning. Theological education, making the faithful to live theologically. I would like to highlight the 3 stages of theological education. How theological education make the faithful to live theologically on the basis of the given text. We have heard reading the 2 readings, the Old Testament reading and the Gospel reading. But I would like to reflect on the 3 readings given for our reflection. First stage, theological education, making the faithful by empowering them to live theologically. Empowering the people of God to live theologically. Joshua chapter 4 verses 1 to 9. An exciting experience took place in the life of the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua. The people of Israel stood at the bank of the river Jordan, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And when we read the previous chapter, we understand that there was a transition of leadership. A transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua. And when Joshua took over the responsibility to lead the Israelites towards Canaan, there was an embarrassing situation took place. People were watching what Joshua is going to do. They were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and the river Jordan was flooded, and they were trying to find out what Joshua is going to do. And Joshua was also perplexed, and he was trying to use the rod that he received from Moses. Moses used the rod to divide the Red Sea. And Joshua was using the same rod to set apart, to cut off the Jordan River. But it did not work. It was a difficult situation for the servant of the God to stand before the people. Definitely people would have compared Joshua with Moses. Joshua was thinking, the rod that was helpful for Moses to cut off the Red Sea, why not it doesn't help me to cut off the water of Jordan? A great test for Joshua, a theological educator. People might have thought that how Joshua is going to lead us like Moses. Theological education happens not in classroom, but theological education takes place always in a particular context. In an embarrassing situation, theological education takes place. When people were struggling between the life and death, theological education took place at the bank of the river Jordan. God does not make the faithful in the same way. The Israelites were made under the leadership of Moses in a different way. And here God wanted the Israelites to learn a different lesson, a different kind of theological education. When Israelites arrived Jordan, they found it was flooded. The river was impassable and crossing was impossible. God spoke to Joshua, asking him to choose 12 men, one from each tribe, and asked them to command them to collect 10 stones from the middle of Jordan, the river Jordan, and carried them and set them at the place where they spent that night. Education through facing the challenges of life. Education to take risk in life. In one way, it was risking one's life. They had the risk of their own traditional expectation that Moses, the leader, would do some miracle. But here, God was expecting the people to do, to work, to learn. So, completely a radical shift of theological education. From the leader, Moses as a leader, he was doing some miracle in the beginning. But now, God expected that the people should involve in that miracle. Suddenly, standing at the middle of the river, water may come back anytime. Anytime the water may come back, but the 12 men stood at the middle of the river Jordan, collected the 12 stones and carried them. Theological education takes place in a difficult situation. This is how God makes men and women to live theologically, making them to take risk in life. Moreover, the Israelites were asked to retell this story to the next generations. When the ark of the Lord's covenant crossed Jordan, the waters were cut off. So the Israelites were asked to retell the stories to the next generation. Tell the generation how God's hands were mighty. Here, God was making them to face challenges in life, to carry stones, to work hard, to pass on this to next generation. And at the end, God asked them to fear the Lord. Theological education is not a training for the professional course. Theological education is not a professional training. It is a vocation. Theological education is not to empower them for high chairs. Very often, people think that theological education will provide them, will take them to high chairs, high positions in the church. But empowering to face the challenges in life, to work hard for the Lord, and to be channel of communication to pass on this to next generation, and also to fear the Lord. Therefore, theology and life are intrinsically interrelated. Theology itself is living. It is not a professional course. Empowering theological education. Secondly, theological education makes the faithful, enlightening them to live theologically. Enlightening theological education. The second reading given for our reflection, first letter to Timothy, chapter 6, verses 11 to 15. Here, Paul was making Timothy a man of God. Theological education makes people of God, men and women of God. In the previous verses, Paul was talking about the false teachers. And here, Paul was advising Timothy to be a man of God. Man of God in contrast to the false teachers. Timothy must be a contrast to, and he must be a different person to the false teachers. In the following verses, he clearly explains, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 11 to 15, he explains how Timothy should be different from the false teachers. And he tells, you man of God should flee or run away. Run away from what? In his second letter, Paul clearly tells Timothy to run away from what? 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. Flee from wealth and women. Flee from wealth and women. And this is what Paul was teaching Timothy, that you must, as a man of God, you must run away from wealth and the lust. Theological education should liberate from such corruption of the church. Theological education should prevent us from crimes, violence, crimes against women. These are the two major problems the Indian church today is facing: corruption and crime. Paul was talking to Timothy, man of God, flee, run away from wealth and women. And he continues saying that man of God should follow righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and godliness. Man of God should follow righteousness and godliness, perseverance. And again he says, man of God should fight the good fight of faith. Good fight of faith. Man of God flees. Man of God follows. Man of God fights. Good fight of faith. Not power fightings. Not power fightings. Someone says, in our churches, there is nothing but politics. Politics has spoiled the Indian church today. Martin Luther once said, where Christ builds a church, there the devil will build a chapel. And today we find that the devil's chapel is within the church and around the church. Man of God should fight a good fight. Good fight. And finally he says, man of God is future oriented. Future oriented. Paul commands Timothy to grasp the reality of the life eternal, to live a life of eternity. Timothy was an enlightened person. He was created. He was made as an enlightened person. And he became the bishop of Ephesus. Acts of Timothy, that book is not listed in our canon. It is not found added in the Bible. Acts of Timothy says that in his 80th year, Timothy, in his 80th year as bishop, he was dragged on the streets and he was stoned to death. Enlightened to die as a martyr. Enlightened even to die for the Lord. Theological education makes a person even to die, to give his own life for the Lord, for the church. This is the power of the theological education. If theological education cannot make us to work for the Lord and to die for the Lord, theological education is meaningless, useless to us. Enlightening theological education. And thirdly, theological education makes the people for envisioning to live theologically. Empowering theological education, enlightening theological education, and envisioning theological education. Envision means to think towards, to move towards, to work towards the future. The gospel reading given for our reflection, Matthew chapter 13, a familiar parable. Normally we call this parable as the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower. But this parable should be really entitled as the parable of the soil. I think that name should be relevant. Because the story and the message emphasize or do not focus on either the sower or the seed. But the focus of the parable was the soil. Here, Jesus was talking about how the hearts of the people can differ regarding openness and receptiveness of God's word. The prominent feature of the story is that of a prepared and unprepared condition of the soil. The seed was the same, the sower was the same, but different kinds of soil. Wayside soil, impenetrable bedrock, weed encumbered field, and the rich fertile soil. 4 kinds of soil. Production is based on the quality of the soil. Production is based on the quality of the soil. This parable clearly tells about the necessity and preparing the soil, making the soil good so that the seed will grow according to the richness of the soil and produce 30-fold or 60-fold or even 100 as much grain as was shown, making the faithful to envision a rich harvest. And that is the purpose of theological education, making the people to envision a rich harvest. This is the crucial function of theological education, preparing the soil for a good harvest. Future harvest depends upon how the soil is prepared. Theological education involves the process of plowing through, making the soil upside down, pressing the soil, stamping the soil, leveling the soil. The soil has to undergo a tremendous process of change, a tremendous radical changes in the hands of the farmer. Definitely, the soil undergo a hard process, but the outcome is a rich harvest. Outcome is the rich harvest. Therefore, theological education, making the faithful by empowering them, by enlightening and envisioning, dream to produce grains to feed the hungry ones. Theological education is not the prerogative of or the privilege of a few or a so-called chosen for the full-time ministry of the church. Theological education should be for the people of God. One of the famous statements of the 20th century was Martin Luther King Jr.'s, "I have a dream." That was considered as the famous statement of the 20th century. And in that statement, he tells, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged. They will not be judged by their color of their skin, but by the content of their character. They will not be judged on the basis of the color of their skin, but rather on the basis of the content of the character." Theological education makes the content of the character. It is the necessity for the people of God. We are called to give importance to theological education. And therefore, let us engage ourselves in theological education because it empowers us to live theologically. It enlightens us to live theologically, to envision us to live theologically. Church has to organize theological education. The early church followed theological education, and therefore there was unity in the church. There was unity in the early church because the early Christian community listened to the apostolic teaching. Preaching alone cannot build the church. Preaching alone cannot build the church. But teaching, theological learning is essential for the church. And therefore, dear brothers and sisters, let us involve ourselves in the learning of theology. There are a lot of possibilities in and around us to do theology, to learn theology. And let us involve in the process of theological education. And that will empower us, enlighten us, and envision for a rich harvest. Amen.